A camel walked into my backyard on a Saturday, and not in a cute viral video way, but like it had an appointment. I still remember the sound, massive hooves slapping the pool deck, water spraying, and Karen screaming like someone had just flipped the world inside out, only the world had in fact been flipped. If you think I'm exaggerating, stick with me, this gets worse before it gets better. I'd been out in the sun minding my own life, grilling, checking the sprinkler timers, the usual suburban rituals when Karen, floating on an inflatable flamingo in my pool, decided my backyard was part of her weekend. She was the kind of neighbor who arrived with an entourage of entitlement sunglasses perched on peroxide hair, a mojito in hand, and a bikini that announced itself like a neon billboard. She didn't so much as turn when I said, "Excuse me, this is private property." She took another sip, adjusted the flamingo, and said, "Oh, hi. Hope you don't mind, it's just so hot." That laugh, thin, brittle, cut through the heat like glass. I'm not proud of what came next. I told her calmly at first, then with the little edge that comes from 3 years of property disputes and passive-aggressive HOA notes. "Actually, yes. This is my pool." She blinked, then smiled as if the rules were optional accessories. "We're neighbors, Marcus. What's mine is yours." She said it like a mantra. And right then the earth seemed to answer with a rumble, a low ancient snort that made the bird feeder tremble. We both turned. Standing by the fence, framed by the scrub and the heat haze, was a camel. 7 feet at the shoulder, coat the color of copper coins, and eyes that tracked us with a kind of patient amusement. Not like one of those zoo animals that look bored, this one looked like it had work to do. Karen's eyes went wide in a way that wasn't just surprise. There was a speechless terror under her makeup that stunned me more than the animal ever could. It nudged the latch with its nose, the gate that I was sure I had locked, and walked in like it had always belonged. Then it drank from my pool, calmly, delicately, almost politely, like it was taking afternoon tea. Karen screamed and paddled toward the steps on her flamingo, and the camel simply lifted its head and labored over her like it was solving a puzzle. I thought about calling animal control, but my phone was inside, of course it was, and the idea of moving across a yard toward a massive animal whose eyes suggested it understood me was, well, not smart. So I froze. Karen whimpered something about heels and couldn't climb out. She was wearing high heels in a pool. I still don't know why that detail stuck, but it did, because it felt like a character reveal in slow motion. Then the camel did something that made the hair on my arm stand up. It smiled. Not a happy, friendly grin, more like a baring of big yellowed teeth that could be a grin or a threat. I couldn't tell. And the hair-raising part was that it seemed to be looking right at Karen like it recognized her beyond the surface, the way you recognize someone who's owed you money. "Do you know him?" I asked, dry with the kind of curiosity that sits on top of fear. Karen's voice went small. "The sanctuary. Desert Haven." Her words tumbled out jagged, hurried about how 6 months earlier money got pulled, a sanctuary had to close, animals were moved or sold, and one man, Omar, who had run the place, had collapsed and died. She kept saying, "We didn't mean," and then saying nothing that sounded like truth. It clicked piece by sickening piece. Not just a random escaped camel, not a bizarre accident, this animal had come looking. The camel's nostrils flared, and then impossibly the sound that came out of its throat was words. I'll never unhear that voice, gravel and wind, and the cadence of a man who had loved animals until loving them killed him. "Habibi," it said, soft, old familiar. Karen went white and went, "Habibi," the camel repeated, and then in perfect English that made my brain pull a cork of disbelief, it said, "You promised Omar." The pool water shivered with the echo. Karen's face crumpled into a confession she didn't know she had rehearsed. She'd bragged about an obscene accessory, $40,000, she admitted later, and the sanctuary's funding had been cut for accounting reasons, board decisions, restructuring. The animals, she said, were relocated. Some were, she insisted. Some hadn't. Some were euthanized, some sold off, and Omar, who'd held the sanctuary together, had withered under it. Heart attack, the doctors said. Stress. Broken. The camel? Omar's camel, or Omar himself, or whatever that mixture of grief and intelligence was, nodded with an awful calm. 40 animals, it said, making the number slow and heavy as a stone. 12 put down. The sound it made then was half roar, half lament. It filled the yard in the afternoon, and something in me that had been used to rationalizing my job into development tightened like a fist. I had worked for years in the business of moving earth and selling dreams. Tracts of land cut into tidy rectangles with swimming pools and three-car garages. We had engineers and reports and lunch meetings that made it all sound noble jobs, progress, economic growth. In the clean light of that Camel's accusation, it read like greed dressed up in a brochure. Omar, it said, had kept records, detailed records, and he hadn't gone quietly. He'd prepared in the only ways he knew how, evidence, notes, people who cared, and apparently, if you accept the impossible, he had taught a camel enough English to summon the truth. It's easy to think animals don't plan, don't hold grudges. It's easier because that way we don't have to look in the mirror. But the camel's eyes were patient as a ledger. You promised, it said again, and this time the words felt like a verdict. That night the phone calls started. Not about the camel at first, about money reports, missing permits. An agent from the Environmental Protection Agency called Clinical and Crisp and told me they had recordings and documents tying Desert Vista, the company I'd helped, to falsified environmental impact statements and bribed inspections. Karen's phone lit up too, auditors, lawyers, news outlets. Screenshots of bank transfers, photos of animals, people who had been keeping tabs on Desert Haven, quietly volunteer vets, journalists. A retired professor began sending what they had. We tried the only two options: panic gives you flee or fight. Karen wanted to liquidate assets and disappear. That plan felt as thin as the swimsuit she'd been wearing. I wanted to fix things, if only so I could keep what I had. But the camel Omar had different ideas. It stood by the fence as the night closed, and when other shapes emerged from the scrub one by one, I realized I'd been wrong about the scale of what I'd done. There were more of them, animals that had never really left. They ringed the subdivision like sentry silhouettes moving with the slow, inevitable rhythm of the desert. By morning, I found myself on my front step, folder in hand, like some contrived restitution scene, and the news vans were because someone had tally and proof, because the camel's appearance hadn't been a rumor, but a summons already rolling in. I don't know why I decided to speak. Maybe because talking felt like taking the first honest breath I'd been denying myself for years. I told the truth. I told the entire rotten story, how reports had been faked, inspectors paid, habitat bulldozed, how we'd convinced ourselves we were building something better. Karen followed me, fragile and furious and utterly human. She admitted the handbag, the lies, the moral arithmetic that put comfort over life. The crowd gasped, yelled, and then awkwardly, miraculously listened. Omar stood by the edge of the gathering eyes like smoldering coals that had watched a man's life and then kept burning. After I read the documents, the agent stepped forward. Arrests, charges, rights, read in that weird legal cadence you hear it on TV and never imagine the weight. Handcuffs. Cameras. Neighbors who had been on our HOA email chain for years, standing in the street, faces that had seemed ordinary, now feeling like witnesses to something darker than gossip. The camel Omar turned and walked back toward the scrub. But before it melted into the heat, the way some desert mirage might, it did something small that felt like absolution. It spoke not to accuse, but to explain. "Love," it said in a voice that carried like wind through a canyon. "Love leaves records." Omar had loved enough people to leave behind allies, notes, a paper trail, and a community who picked up where he'd been forced to stop. It wasn't mystical, no glowing soul transfer fantasy, and yet when you've looked someone in the eyes and seen what grief taught them, you stop dismissing the impossible so fast. What mattered wasn't whether a man's spirit had literally become a camel. What mattered was that truth was louder than our schedules and more durable than our excuses. The animals found homes. Investigations began. The arboreal things we tend to call progress were suddenly counted in the cost they'd exacted. If there's a lesson in this, if you want my blunt, messy human one, it's this: convenience as a moral principle is poison. When you choose ease over care, you make a ledger where dollars count but lives don't. And sometimes life is patient like a camel at a pool, and it comes back asking for the accounting. In the end, there was a courthouse and a judge and consequences. There was also, quietly, a little rewilding tortoises finding shade beneath recovering brush cacti that stubbornly pushed up through soil that had been scraped raw. Justice wasn't cinematic. There were plea bargains and legal gray, and yet watching Omar walk back into the desert one last time felt like seeing a balance shifted. It felt like karma that wasn't theatrical revenge, but simple, stubborn rightness. So here's what I want to leave you with, because you're still reading, and I want you to feel the question as much as I felt the rattling of the pool fence that day. How much are we willing to lose to keep what we think we deserve? When does convenience become cruelty? And if the world keeps a ledger, will you be on the side that can look back and say, I tried to fix it? Or will you be the one hiding receipts for a handbag while someone else pays with their life? Tell me, have you ever seen the cost of comfort spelled out in real time? Share it. Argue with me. Tell me I'm sentimental. Or tell me I'm right. Either way, I want to hear what you would have done standing on that pool deck watching a Camel drink and listening to a voice that made you finally read the fine print.